Hello, you're listening to the Art History Symposium, brought to you by the University of California at Davis. With every episode, we'll bring you the latest in art historical research from faculty, students, and alumni of UC Davis. Our first fall 2009 season starts out with one of our very own MA candidates in art history, Laura Hutchison. Laura just began her second year here at UC Davis, coming from Hendrix University in Arkansas. Her primary area of research is ancient Greek art, but for this lecture, we will hear her building on her knowledge of the classics and exploring the theme of temporality in three of Michelangelo's early sculptures. Enjoy.
Okay, so we're going to get started. Laura is talking about a paper that she's written for the Hawaii Conference in Humanities and the Arts on Michelangelo and three of his early sculptures. So off you go.
Thank you for that introduction. This paper came out of an independent study course that I took with Professor Ruda last spring. And as Graham said, it was recently accepted to be read at a conference in January. The project developed out of my own interest in proportions of the sculpted human figure and the relationship between the audience and the observed object. I've prepared today's talk with the conference guidelines in mind, so it should only be about 20 minutes, and your questions and feedback would be greatly appreciated. Michelangelo never published his theory on human proportion. Beginning with Vasari, critics and scholars have thus far attempted to understand Michelangelo's abstract theory through analysis of his use of proportion, anatomy, or posture. The three approaches to his figures and his possible theory have remained almost completely separate in their methods. Michelangelo's use of an ordered proportion is often interpreted as either in opposition to or deeply connected to the Polyclitan canon. A study of the hypermuscular anatomy of Michelangelo's figures often results in a legitimizing of the artist's scientific knowledge or unproductive anecdotes about his own personal preoccupation with the male figure. Analysis of posture exhibited by his characters frequently culminates in the predictably iconographical reading of emotions made manifest in form. I would like to suggest that these methods of researching his possible theory on human proportions should be considered alongside the element of time. Michelangelo's use of time as a qualifier of the human figure as ideal is twofold. First, the audience's experience of his works requires a brief moment for which the piece is allowed to come to life, to move beyond the material and allow an exchange between the observer and the observed. Second, Michelangelo's figures are themselves eternally captured in a moment of a broader narrative or action. Three of his early sculpted images of the male nude, his Bacchus, the Christ figure of his Pieta, and David, allow the analysis of temporality because they were executed early in Michelangelo's career, between 1496 and 1504. At this time, the artist was still freshly experimenting with his craft, the human figure, and the act of capturing life in a lifeless material. Michelangelo most certainly would have been aware of the Polyclitan canon through ancient sources such as Pliny the Elder, Galen, and Vitruvius. Pliny worked in the 1st century BCE and wrote specifically about the Polyclitan canon. Galen, working in the 2nd century CE, was devoted to the study of medicine. He prided himself on the knowledge of the human body by means of dissection. Galen also writes of Polyclitus, briefly mentioning the statue that was believed to have been the embodiment of Polyclitus's treatise of perfect proportions. This original statue of the ideal proportion, the canon, is now lost. However, one may successfully look to his bronze Doryphorus, of which we have a Roman marble copy, for a similar example of the Polyclitan preoccupation with order and proportion. The Doryphorus, meaning spear bearer, stands in a moment of physical and psychological contrapposto. His face is calm and his body is resting, but he is holding a spear which references the impending battle or crisis to come. The Doryphorus is most likely an anonymous male figure, and he stands as an abstraction of balanced intellect. The sculpture, referencing the bronze Greek original, would most likely be on display for observation in the round. Michelangelo would have experienced ancient sculptures much like the ancient viewer, through careful observation of the form, proportion, and image before the moment of resolution. I will not be directly comparing the Doryphorus to the three male figures selected for this study. Rather, I'm examining this issue of a temporal experience, which is required of the sculptural form and present in the Doryphorus as well as many other Greco-Roman images of the human figure. I am attempting to reconcile this temporality with the proportions, anatomy, and posture found in Michelangelo's early representations of the male figure. Despite their different meanings and functions as public, private, and religious sculptures, I suggest that these images of the human figure both invite a temporal experience from the audience and eternally capture a dynamic snapshot of a larger narrative. By working with and distorting the human proportions, Michelangelo was engaging in and responding to what he would have seen as a nearly 2,000-year-old debate of the self, or mankind's order, in relation to the order of the cosmos. The proportions found in the male figures of these three early sculptures may be more broadly connected by means of their monumental size. David is not usually named in notes written in the Renaissance, but simply described as Il Gigante, or the giant. Michelangelo manipulates the proportions and rational scale of the male figure to literally expand the emotional content and the viewer's response. On the size of the nearly 7-foot-tall Bacchus, James Hall writes, quote, "In terms of height, the Bacchus is not an inordinately large statue for its period, but it feels far larger because of its wayward body language, which seems to claim a vast amount of ambient airspace." Michelangelo exaggerates the traditional contrapposto in order to further extend the narrative in which this Bacchus exists. And in this slide, I have attempted to map out this exaggeration of the contrapposto that I found when looking at Bacchus. The non-traditional extension of contrapposto further emphasizes the monumentality of the sculpture. This use of space may be interpreted as a metaphor for the monumentality of the classical past, even if at times the abstracted images or characters were ridiculously intoxicated. Michelangelo was attempting to emulate the ancient sculptors, which had been elevated to quasi-divine status by other Renaissance artists and critics. The artist wished to maintain, if not surpass, the classical ideal in his own figures. Bacchus was known to have been on display in the garden of Jacopo Galli, among a collection of authentic antique statuary, and could be misinterpreted as an ancient relic. Indeed, the artist himself, as recounted by Vasari, wished for the audience to mistake the piece as a recently unearthed treasure from the classical past. Various anecdotes allude to the removal and addition of the hand holding the cup when the statue was on display, with the intention that this would further trick the audience into reading the image as ancient. And in this image, you can see that Bacchus is missing his hand that would be holding the cup. This garden setting, which was originally intended for the piece, allowed the viewer's perception of Bacchus to change as one walked clockwise around the statue. The god would have appeared to stumble, to observe his own audience through the handle of his cup, and to finally drag the pan-child as he walks away. Similarly, the shifting sunlight in the garden would allow the facial expressions and tone of the marble to change throughout the day. The temporal experience of the statue is dependent on the movement of the viewer, but also of the change of sunlight and even the twisted posture and exaggerated proportions of the Bacchus figure. Michelangelo's intentions of fooling the audience may be extended to include the mocking of the Greco-Roman god and the male nude ideal. The disorderly state of the figure of Bacchus is a sight at which the ancients would have been appalled, thus illustrating a fully Renaissance interpretation of the Roman god. Later Roman images of the god as intoxicated and more youthful clearly present the god with a clean-cut, ideal physique. Michelangelo, however, softens the traditionally chiseled torso into a fuller and more bloated abdomen. Many scholars, beginning with Vasari, have dwelled on the anatomy of the Bacchus figure as an expression of the harmonious union of gendered body parts, often confusing the bloated belly for a feminine abdomen and the slender limbs as masculine brawn. This proposal for the balance of feminine and masculine units suggests a deeper attempt at understanding the proportions of the Bacchus figure. Vasari praises the piece for its marvelous combination of various parts of the body, and most particularly to give it both the slenderness of the young male figure and the fleshiness and roundness of the female, end quote. The issue of gender and the union of two polarized types is conflated with the ancient tradition of considering the body as many parts of a whole. Such is Galen's argument that, quote, it is possible to find ideal proportion only after much time in labor and through long experience of the individual parts, end quote. Rather than looking at the Bacchus as a cohesion of many parts, perhaps it is more effective to consider the Bacchus as an idiosyncratic response to the monumentality of the classical past and the ideal male nude. Michelangelo's distortion of the proportions, contrapposto, and even facial features suggest that the artist was reclaiming a Greco-Roman idea as something beyond ideal, which must be experienced by the audience as they come to understand the narrative structure of the piece. Although it is the earliest of the three selected sculptural images, the Bacchus suggests a commanding response to the long-standing tradition of the heroic male nude by means of its own proportion, anatomy, posture, and temporality. Vasari conflates the anatomy seen in Michelangelo's Pieta with the overall idealism of the human figure, praising, quote, the beauty of its limbs and the skill with which the body is carved, a nude so well endowed with muscles, veins, and nerves stretched over the framework of bones, end quote. It is clear that Vasari himself understands human anatomy, and his reading of this piece becomes a learned discussion between artist and critic. The description continues with further mention of, quote, harmony in the joints and the articulations of the arms, torso, and legs with their finely wrought pulses and veins, end quote. It may be more effective to question Michelangelo's exaggeration of the anatomical features, rather than to simply admonish it as scientific and/or an artistic achievement. A synthesis of both classical and Christian elements was essential to the assimilation of Greco-Roman images into Renaissance culture, as exhibited in the Christ figure of Michelangelo's Pieta. When discussing the artist's approach to the male figure, James Hall barely mentions polyclitus or orderly proportion at all. Rather, Hall relates the nude male form to Christ's passion, arguing that, quote, in Michelangelo's art it is always Judgment Day, the time when bodies reclaim their flesh and in all their nakedness go before their God, end quote. This connection between the male figure, the passion, and the anatomy forces the Christ figure of the Pieta into an anatomical reading, instead of requiring or even allowing a reading of proportions. The manipulation of Christ's anatomy is clearly contrasted with the smooth, flowing robes of the Virgin Mary, the effect of which is a polarity of genders, of the material and supernatural, and of the living and the dormant. Christ nearly appears to writhe on his mother's lap. His head rolls back, his veins nearly pop with the pressure of the blood pumping through them. However, we know that he is dead because of the weight of Christ's body, as suggested by the pull of his legs and the dangling of his arm, along with the implied context of the scene. This disconnect between the anatomy of living flesh and the lifeless posture of Christ is echoed in the material itself. The veins of the marble seem to become part of the anatomy, complementing the veins sculpted into the body, while the sheen of the material reminds the audience that it is, in fact, a statue. The wide base, along with the placement of the statue in a niche, suggest a sort of stagnancy in the intended viewing. The figure, which nearly consumes the Virgin, is pulled towards the base of the statue. Rather than the dynamic twist found in Bacchus, Christ's posture seems to suggest a null existence or dead weight. Christ is forever laid across the lap of the Virgin Mary, splayed before the audience and God in death. The temporal experience created by the strained limbs and formal emphasis on the stone becomes one of immense heaviness. Rather than requiring a 360-degree motion of audience or sunlight, the Pietà simply asks for frontal observation and self-reflection. It is in this respect that the temporal experience of the Pietà may be read as the most confidently somber of Michelangelo's presentations of the male nude. Michelangelo has used the male form, specifically anatomy, to represent the greater cooperative pair of formal and iconographic, or body and spirit. The anatomy, then, becomes complementary to the overall scale of the male figure. It allows a balance both between the figures and within each separate figure, which highlights an eternal limbo of living and dead. Both Vasari and Kenneth Clark suggest that the anatomy of David is fundamental in understanding Michelangelo's presentation of the human form. When describing the piece, Vasari notes that, quote, the contours of its legs are extremely beautiful, along with the splendid articulations and grace of its flanks, end quote. Clark's description of the piece, which places David within a survey of the monumental nudes of Western art, emphasizes the anatomy as an artistic feat. Clark begins with a study of the torso alone, providing his reader with a cropped image of the torso as the only image of David in his text. Clark relates Michelangelo's own skillful rendering of anatomy to the softer forms of ancient sculpture, saying, quote, given the torso alone, he might be claimed as the climax of that long search for harmony, which started with the fragment from Miletos or the Critios youth. True, there is a ripple of ribs and muscles, and, beneath it, some distant storm that distinguishes the David's torso from those of the most vigorous antiques, end quote. Both Vasari and Clark recognize the artist's technical skill specifically through his rendering of human anatomy. Although the anatomy is physically inaccurate, it has been interpreted as essential in Michelangelo's figure. Indeed, the emotions and narrative of David are made manifest in the posture and anatomy of the figure. The figure's stare into an unidentified distance suggests that he is looking at his match, while the unnaturally wide rib cage and heavy hands clutching parts of the sling act as a metaphor for the monumental deed which he is about to commit. Michelangelo has depicted David in the moment before he slays Goliath. The skin stretches across the neck, torso, and arm muscles as if the artist seeks to over-exaggerate the sharp twist of the head away from the body. Rather than the psychological calm found in the Doryphoros, the strained posture, highlighted by the taut muscles and skin, suggests that David is captured in a state of psychological and physical tension. David illustrates Michelangelo's authoritative use of anatomy in the context of monumentality. The unnaturally large hands, torso, neck, and hair were meant to strengthen the figure, with the intention that it would be seen from below one of the buttresses of the Florence Cathedral. The distortion is made more obvious when the figure is viewed more closely from below at the Gallery of Florence of Fine Arts, where he is on display today. However, the sling is visible only from behind the statue. Of course, this element of the statue is visible as it is on display today, but if the statue were to be viewed from below the buttresses of the cathedral, David would stand as a much more generic male nude. The full tension of David is revealed as one walks around the statue. The identity of the figure was less obvious in the intended setting for the statue, and the temporal experience would then rest on the shifting sunlight. The shadows created by his heavy hair and widened torso would change with the sunlight throughout the day. And yet, Michelangelo has manipulated the Polycliton canon in order to more truthfully portray the male figure. His exaggeration of specific body parts is in effect an optical illusion, which allows the figure to serve as a truly monumental reference to the ideal male nude. This original display of the statue would have allowed for David to step out beyond the Greco-Roman moment of tension and stand instead as an eternal reference to the Greco-Roman male nude. The exaggeration of proportions and anatomy are the means by which Michelangelo actively responds to the classical ideal. Similarly, the monumentality of the piece, as accentuated by his hands, head, and torso, suggests a reference to the monumentality of ancient sculpture and perhaps even the permanency of the classical past. David is captured in a moment of tension and simultaneously presented as an eternal ideal. Michelangelo's male figures, presented in his Bacchus, Christ, and David, maintain a fully balanced union of ever-shifting temporal experience and eternal subject. Images of the male nude of ancient Greco-Roman culture, such as Polyclitus's Doryphoros, presented the physical state of stationary before active, or as the psychological calm before a moment of crisis. Michelangelo's three early male figures reference the idealized proportions of the male form by means of their obvious nudity and carefully rendered anatomy. However, the artist manipulates the generic nude male into something completely individual with the exaggeration of posture, manipulation of anatomy, and allusion to a much larger story from which the characters are captured. If we are to return to the human form in a moment of tension. The human proportions of Michelangelo's early sculpted male figures become more clear. Michelangelo developed the relationships between the segments of the body into a dynamic experience that shifts with each new perspective. Thank you.
To find out more information on the people and events affiliated with the Art History Symposium, please visit our website at www.ucdavis.edu/arthistory. You can also look us up on Facebook under Art History UC Davis. Your feedback and commentary is always welcome. This has been the Art History Symposium, brought to you by the University of California at Davis. Thanks for listening.